Hello, and welcome to this COPE webinar on data policies. A major trend worldwide is to encourage open data, open science, and open research, aiming for transparency, reproducibility, and data access and reuse. There are implications for all involved in knowledge creation. COPE is holding this one-hour webinar for members to hear from 3 speakers who will share their ideas and experiences with data policies. I am Trevor Lane, a consultant at a publishing support service provider called Edance, and I'm the chair of COPE's Member Services Subcommittee. So please do let me know what future webinars and resources COPE can provide to best serve and engage with members. Our guest speakers are Rebecca Grant, Research Data Manager, and Varsha Khodiyar, Data Curation Manager from Springer Nature, and Todd Carpenter, Executive Director of the National Information Standards Organization in the US. Now, COPE has a core practice statement on data and reproducibility, which says journals should include policies on data availability and encourage the use of reporting guidelines and registration of clinical trials and other study designs. COPE also took part in drafting the Journal Transparency and Openness Promotion, or TOP, guidelines and its implementation guidelines, and a forum discussion on data sharing. There's also advice on data sharing from the COPE Education Subcommittee and trial institution members, and a research poster on data policies showing that biomedical journals have so far implemented data policies more commonly than other disciplines. Indeed, the ICMJE, or International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, requires journal reports of trials to contain a data sharing statement as from yesterday, the 1st of July 2018. And from next year, trials need transparent data sharing plans. So that's a quick background. Let's now hear from Rebecca Grant and then Varsha Khodiyar about the Springer Nature experience of creating and implementing data policies.
Thank you. Hope everyone can hear me okay. So I'm co-presenting with my colleague Varsha. So I'm going to be talking more from the project management perspective of rolling out data policies across Springer Nature journals, and then Varsha can speak more to the editorial perspective of working on a journal that has quite a stringent data policy in place. Okay, so I'm sure you're familiar with Springer Nature. We're one of the biggest academic publishers in the world, home to brands and imprints including Springer, Nature, Biomed Central or BMC, Palgrave Macmillan and Scientific American. So since 2016, we've been rolling out standardized data policies across all of our Springer Nature journals, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the processes and where we are at the moment in terms of policy implementation. So this provides a little bit of context around why we started this project. This is research undertaken by JISC, the UK funder, in 2015, and what they were trying to do was to map the landscape in terms of which policies are available to researchers for particular journals. So what they concluded was actually there was no point in continuing this research because the landscape was so varied that it actually wasn't possible to get a sense of consistency across journals and journal publishers. So what they recommended following that research project was that the whole policy landscape and ecosystem was in need of harmonization and standardization, and that was really the starting point for the Springer Nature data sharing project. So the project, I was not a part of the initial expert group that came together to develop the policies, but it was based on the existing policy types that Springer Nature journals already had in place. So looking to see were there common aspects across our journal policies and what was missing. And the idea was that the policies that we did develop would be appropriate no matter which discipline the journal was publishing in. So we ended up with 4 different data policies. They have similar features across all of them, but the requirements vary. So for example, the type 1 policy would state that data sharing and data citation are encouraged, but they're not required. So if an author decides not to share their data, that won't prevent them from publishing in that journal. And then we go all the way up to the type 4 data policy, where data sharing is mandated. So not only are authors required to share their data, they need to provide evidence, and there's an expectation that data will go through peer review as well as their paper. So the process involved working closely with the journal editors in order to establish which of these data policies might be most appropriate for their journal. So for example, in the humanities, where there might not be so much of a culture of data sharing, most of those journals would have gone for the type 1 policy, whereas in the life sciences, where often those journals already had a policy in place, they were more likely to go for the type 3 or type 4. The process involved implementing standardized text, both within instructions for authors on those journals and also within their manuscript submission system. So the idea was that across all of our journals, authors would have pretty consistent information about what's required of them. So as I said, there are different requirements depending on the policy type, but there are common features. So all of the policies, no matter which one the journal has, will always recommend that an author shares data in a repository rather than uploading it as supplementary material or supplementary information. All of the policies will also encourage or mandate that authors cite public data sets in their reference lists or their bibliographies. And for all of the policies, we also provide a publisher help desk so that authors can seek assistance if they need it. So this help desk was set up at the same time as we started the policy rollout, and it provides assistance not only to authors but also to editors who might have questions about how policies should be adhered to. It's run by my own team, the data publishing team, and we answer queries within 2 business days, but it's usually quicker, to be honest. And we answer all types of questions around research data. So like obviously a lot of the questions we get are directly in relation to the data policy. So an author might be asked to do something that they haven't been asked to do before, for example, to cite a data set, and they sometimes need extra advice around how to do that. But if researchers have other queries, for example, around digital preservation or copyright and licensing, we would answer those too. We also always encourage the use of best practices. So although we do have our own service that assists researchers in publishing their data in a repository, if there's a community repository that's more appropriate for that researcher and that data type, then we would always encourage them to go directly to it. In terms of implementations, so this pie chart is slightly out of date because we have implemented about another 300 journals since this was created, but the proportions have stayed roughly the same. So you can see that the majority of the journals have the type 1 policy that encourages research data sharing. So the fewest nearly have the type 2 policy, which strongly encourages data sharing, and it also encourages the use of data availability statements. So then the type 3 policy, that number is brought up by the fact that all Nature journals and all BMC journals have a type 3 policy. So that policy doesn't yet require data sharing, but it does require that the author includes a data availability statement. So even if they've decided not to share, they have to state that explicitly. And then the type 4 policy, which is the most stringent policy, only 6 of our journals have it. And one of those journals is Citation. So Varsha is going to talk a little bit about their experiences of implementing this type of policy.
As Rebecca said, so I'm going to talk about scientific data where we have implemented a type 4 policy. So this is the web page for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the journal. It's an online only journal. It's open access, which means the papers that are published are accessible by everyone. So one of the things that is mandated in the type 4 policies is that data sharing via repositories has to be supported, and I've crossed out supported and put mandated because at scientific data we go a step further and we mandate that data has to be shared via repositories. And so we give guidance to authors right on our homepage as to where they can go to get more information about repositories that could be suitable for their data. We split these repositories into sort of general discipline specific sections because we are a multidisciplinary journal. So we provide guidance for all disciplines on the types of repositories that could be suitable. I think we have just under 100 repositories listed there at the moment, and this list is actively maintained. So we will make sure that repositories that are added to this list are actually checked for how they preserve data and whether they provide persistent identifiers and so on. Actually, uploading data to a repository has to be done in order to complete manuscript submission. So this is just a snapshot of our manuscript uploading system. And one of the questions you can see here is asked, have you uploaded your primary data files to a publicly accessible repository? So if the author then clicks yes, they're asked for the repository name and the key details about the data set so that this data is then accessible to peer reviewers. If they have not uploaded the data at this stage, they have the option to upload it to Figshare via this screen, so they don't actually have to go outside of our manuscript submission screen. They are, of course, welcome to go outside of the system, upload their data and come back. But if what we find is a lot of authors have data that doesn't really fit neatly into a specific discipline-specific repository, and so this allows them to still share their data. So another part is the guidance, peer review for type 4 policy. We have to give guidance to peer reviewers for looking at the data file. So this is an example of the kind of thing that the peer reviewers can see. So up front, the authors are asked for any passcodes or passwords required to access data if it's embargoed. And again, we work with repositories. A lot of the repositories we work with can help authors to provide data in a way in which it's embargoed until publication, but reviewers can get access to it. When the reviewers come to look at the data sets, they get clear links to the data sets. So you can see in the example here, this example at the top here, I hope you can see the mouse moving, that is to an embargoed data set. So the only people that can access this are people who have this link. That link is only shared with our reviewers, and that link is then made inactive after a certain point. So if a peer reviewer comes to this several weeks down the line, they will no longer have access to this data. This is another example of a peer reviewer link. This is to a Figshare data set. The data set archived at Figshare, and again, this link is made inactive once the data has been, once peer review has finished. We have the editorial office at Scientific Data who are available to help reviewers in case they have any issues accessing data, because we want our reviewers to be able to access their data. And the kinds of things we ask our referees to consider are things about the data, whether the data was gathered in an experimentally rigorous manner, whether the technical quality of the data is sufficient for reuse, whether the description of how the data were generated is complete, and whether the data files and the repository record have good explanations as to how these came about, and whether the data files have good integrity. We also ask our reviewers to consider whether the data that as they have been reported are consistent with the relevant minimum reporting standards for their field. We also ask reviewers to consider whether the data have been archived to the most appropriate repository. Now, both of these are more developed in some fields and less developed in others. So, for example, the biological sciences have many well-established reporting guidelines, which all experts in that field will know that these are the minimal reporting standards that must be adhered to. Biological sciences also tend to have the most developed repositories. So, for example, if you have nucleotide sequence data, it has to be in a repository such as GenBank, and we as a journal will not publish a data set or a paper on a data set that has not been archived to the appropriate repository. And as I say, the example, in this particular case, the data, the paper would not pass peer review until the data had been removed to a community mandated repository, and this line was held firm by our reviewers and by our editorial board as well as our in-house editors. And I just wanted to point out fairsharing.org as an example of a location where a lot of the standards, especially in biological sciences, have been gathered, and this is a good resource for editors, for journals who are considering what might be an appropriate standard for a particular data set. We ask authors to supply statements explaining how supporting data can be accessed, and we do this via a specialist section which we call data records. And you can see in the example here, the data records section go into detail about each of the files that make up this particular data set and what is in those files and how those files can be accessed. Again, here I've crossed out permitted because the type 4 policy says data citation is permitted, and we've crossed this out and said mandated because, again, at Scientific Data we mandate that data must be cited formally. And this is an example, so you can see it says data citation 1 in brackets within the text of the paper up here. This is then formally cited in the data citation section, which you can see the format is very similar to a literature citation. You have authors, you have, instead of a journal name, you have the repository name and then a link to the data. And at Scientific Data, we also ensure that the data citations are marked up as data citations within the XML of the paper. And so the data citations are machine accessible as well as human accessible. So another key point about Scientific Data is we have data curation editors who ensure that the key metadata about the data sets are being described. So in general terms, we're asking authors to record where their sample originated, what the sample was, what key characteristics would be data users need to know about your sources and samples, what was done to those sources and samples to actually create the digital data files, and then where those data files are. And during this curation process, the manuscript is reread, the data archive is checked, and we find quite often minor issues with the data or the manuscript, so these are then corrected at this stage before the paper is published. And we also, at this stage, check the data citations for formatting and accuracy, with the intention that once these papers are published, the data links will always work. So we make sure that the persistent identifiers are used by the authors in the paper as opposed to the search URLs, which often repositories do use. Scientific Data, this is in consistency with the Type 4 policy. We provide advice on data repositories. We have two repositories in particular which are integrated with our submission system. The editors are able to advise on best practice for sharing clinical data, for example, which can't necessarily be openly shared but can still be shared in a good way. We make sure that reviewers are given access to data during peer review and specific guidance on this. Authors have to provide data availability and data access statements in their manuscripts, and we ensure that the links to the data are working before the papers are actually published.
Okay, so I just wanted to wrap up with some of the lessons learned from our policy implementation project to date. So obviously, Scientific Data has one of the most rigorous policies, and it actually goes beyond our Type 4 data policy. So it's really demonstrating best practices in data sharing and data peer review. But there was a lot to be learned from implementing all of the policy types across the journals, particularly these disciplinary differences that we try to address through the provision of different levels of policy, because really there are big differences in how ready research communities are to share. And not only that, but as we continue to roll out the policies, I'm still talking to editors who not only are they not familiar with data sharing, but they tell me that they don't believe in it, so they are just not going to have a policy at all. And saying that, I think it's really important that implementing any kind of research data policy is better than not having a policy, because it really starts the journal on a journey towards data sharing. So over time, we would encourage our journals, if they'd like to move up the policy level. So you might start with a type 1 policy. Over time, you see that's working well and your authors understand it, and then you might decide to move up to a type 2 or 3 policy. Also, the process has to be really easy for the editors. And that might mean that you need to speak to editors on an individual basis. In fact, most of the time we do. So for some of our journal imprints, like the Nature journals, we had an overall decision made that the type 3 policy was most appropriate. But for some of our other imprints, we work directly with the editors-in-chief to talk to them through what their policy options are and what might be most appropriate. And finally, if you require journals to have stronger policies, then you have to have tools and resources in place to support them. Because what we found with a lot of our Springer Research Group journals was that they didn't have the editorial support to enforce any kind of mandate. So when you start asking journal editors to enforce data availability statements, you need to provide them with some kind of resource to allow them to do those checks. So that's something that we put in place. But all of our policy text is, of course, available on our website, and it's also licensed under a Creative Commons attribution-only license. So if journals want to reuse the work that we've already done in developing these policies, then they're welcome to do that. So that was all that we wanted to say, and looking forward to getting some questions from you.
Okay, great. Rebecca and Varsha, thank you very much for the publisher's inside view of logistics and technology and personnel implications of data sharing. If you thought that you need some improved training in the future, we also need global standards, because this is a global phenomenon. And this is the topic of Todd's talk. And I'll hand the mouse over to Todd.
Great. I hope everyone can hear me. So as Trevor mentioned, building a good research data policy is really something that really needs to be built around standards. So on the left is scientific data is really not what it used to be. On the left is an example of meteorological scientific data sharing from the 16th century. And on the right is a visualization of modern day data sharing and how much that has changed in our world. Researchers and scholars are really expecting to have access to the information provided in this content, in this form, and data sharing is a key element of that process. There are and have been a number of research data policies organized over the last several years. Some have come from publishers, some have come from universities, some have come from funding organizations in terms of pushing the community forward, in terms of getting researchers to expand their outreach into the community. And one of the challenges is a lot of these data policies require standards, and those standards need to keep up with our current environment. And one of the great comments about standards is that there are so many to choose from. A quote from Andrew Tannenbaum talking about the number and availability of standards is sort of almost overwhelming. As was mentioned in the Fair Sharing website, there's over 1,100 data data standards related to sharing research data sets. So we as a community need to step up. We as a community need to understand what those standards are and how they affect scholarly publishing, and particularly in data sharing. A little bit about my organization, the National Information Standards Organization, and apologies for the lag. NISO is a nonprofit industry trade organization accredited by the American National Standards Institute to create standards for information creation, distribution, discovery, and preservation. We're a volunteer-driven organization with about 500 participants spread out across the world. We're responsible for a variety of standards such as DOI, Dublin Core Metadata, MARC standards, ISBN, ISSN, and other international standards. So there are four main areas where data standards are critical in data management policies. There are several others. We certainly don't want to get into all of those. In the interest of time, we're just going to dig into these four. Identification and the standards around identifying elements in data sharing. There is description and discovery, which is focused particularly on metadata. There are best practices around peer review, and then finally citation, all of which have developed over the last several years in some ways. The first of these that I'll dig into a little bit more detail is identification. And the first element of this identification stream is the ORCID. ORCID IDs. ORCID IDs identify researchers and scholars in the scholarly communication landscape. It was founded in 2012 and rapidly become an important player in information management, particularly regarding personnel information. And there are now more than 4.5 million ORCIDs that have been assigned. And this has become a critical component in identifying the researcher that is creating or working with a research data set. A second element of this is the institutional identification question. What are the institutions involved with the creation of a data set? That could be the university, that could be the research institute. Also, we also want to identify the institutions that are around funding, and what are the funding bodies that are funding research data sets. Another element of identification here is the data set itself. And DataCite is an organization that is a DOI registration agency that assigns digital object identifiers for data sets, as well as manages the metadata around the data set creation. DataCite isn't the only way to identify a data set, but critically important in the discovery process and the principles of data sharing are the identification of that data set. It's critically important that identifiers be assigned. Now, there are other persistent identifiers. There are a tremendous number of persistent identifiers. DOIs and DataCite DOIs are not the only identifiers that can be used to identify a data set. There are ARCs. There are different domain-specific identifiers. NISO has a list of over 70 domain-specific and other identifiers related to data sets that we published a couple years ago. Another issue is the description and discovery. So how do we describe the data set, and how do we make it available for reuse? Has everything to do with metadata. Metadata is a critical component in the description of data sets, allowing them to be accessible. FAIR was a project of the Force 11 group launched in 2014, and the project released its final recommendations in March of 2016, and they're summarized in these four words: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The FAIR principles are actually more than four. There are actually a set of 15 principles around which you can work towards how to make things findable, how to make things, data sets, accessible, how to make things, data sets, interoperable, and make them reusable. And these 15 set of guiding principles actually are all focused, almost all, on metadata. Only 2 of the 16 don't mention metadata. Metadata around data sets is critical to discover, to understand what is in that data set, how to use the things that are in that data set, understand the data that's in it and present, and how to reuse it in a variety of applications. There is a tremendous number of metadata standards that can be applied to research data sets. Dublin Core is one of the most commonly used data models, metadata models, but there are a variety of others. The fairsharing.org website, as well as the re3data.org websites, give a lot of information about the metadata that can be used in assigning to research data sets. In a 2014 study of over 4,000 researchers in the UK by David Nichols, it was generally agreed that data should be peer-reviewed. The question then is not whether data should be peer-reviewed or not. And I was pleased to see in the survey that about 38% of you are actually doing peer review of data sets. But what constitutes peer review of a data set? And this was something that I looked into in a 2016 study that I conducted, looking at the peer review policies of data publishing journals and what constituted peer review of those data sets. Here are some links to where you can get access to the full paper. But I found that a peer review of data sets kind of generally fell into 5 broad categories. There was editorial review, a review of the metadata quality, a review of the actual data quality, a review of the methodology that was undertaken, and then some other miscellaneous questions that were provided to peer reviewers. Of those, the most referenced, most included statement or requirement for peer reviewers actually focused on editorial quality and metadata quality, as well as open licensing. Is this data open and available? Overall quality of the data set, as well as links to public repositories. These are generally about access, not about the data quality itself. Actually, some of the data quality issues were amongst the least referenced in the policy statements. Is the data high quality? Are there data anomalies? What is the plausibility of this data set? How are outliers identified and treated? These are kind of interesting to look at what is going on with research data sets. So generally what's constitute robust peer review at the moment in those data publishing journals has to do with editorial quality, cohesion, links to repositories, openness, licensing. Overall quality of metadata is particularly important, with a focus on replicability, as opposed to digging down deep into the data and looking at specifically what the data is and can do. And finally, I'll touch briefly on citation as another element of a data citation policy. There was in Amsterdam at a Force 11 meeting in 2012, I was involved in a group of people who put together a kind of brief manifesto of what should be included in a data citation policy. That work then grew out of an award that was given out at that Force 11 meeting, and then built into a group that developed the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles. And that laid out a pretty robust structure of trying to encourage the community to build citation into data sharing policies. And there's been certainly more formal work related to standards. There's 2 active working groups taking place now that are focused on data citation as included in part of bibliographic references. There's an ISO project, ISO 690, as well as NISO's project Z39.29. These are two standards on bibliographic reference. That's work that's ongoing, and part of that is to include data citation into those peer review policies. And I know I'm running just a little bit long, so just want to touch briefly on the transparency and open promotion statement guidelines that have been put forward by the Center for Open Science. And this is a set of guidelines that look towards building openness in scholarly communication. And one of those things has to do, one of those implementation guidelines, it has to do not only with data, but any scholarly resource. And is this scholarly resource publicly available or not? And if so, please provide some information about how to access that material. I'm sorry the slides aren't advancing, but I know that you'll have access to those slides later on. More information about the top guidelines and the other material that are included in this is linked throughout the presentation slides, and we'll get those out to you. So with that, I'll draw my slide deck to my presentation to a close, even though I can't manage to get to the final slide. My contact information is included in there. So with that, pass it back to Trevor.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Thanks for getting through the technological problems. So that was a good overview of how data sharing and transparency can be standardized and coordinated within the research ecosystem. And I'd like to go straight to the questions, so please type any more questions. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Heather, who's from the American Chemical Society and Coke Council member, chair of the Education Subcommittee, to sort through the questions.
Thanks, Trevor. And we'll get started with a question for Rebecca. Is the Research Data Help Desk free for authors and editors of Springer journals?
Yeah, that's an easy one. So yes, it's free, and you also don't need to be an author or an editor of Springer Nature Journal to use it. So if you're publishing with another publisher and you have a question about research data sharing, we would answer that question. So most of our questions do come from Springer Nature authors, obviously, but we don't turn any queries away.
Great. And the next question is for Varsha. You mentioned checking the quality of data files, but can you comment any more about any differences in checking primary or raw data files versus other types of data that you might see?
So in terms of whether the data, as in what level of data should be shared, whether it's the primary data or a more processed data set, that's something that we ask our editorial board members and our peer reviewers. I mean, they're the experts in the field, and the answer to what level of data should be shared varies depending on what type of data you're looking at sharing, which discipline you're sharing from. So as curators in the editorial office, we don't check the content, but what we do check is that the descriptions match what we see in the repositories.
While Heather's sorting through the questions, I'd like to ask Todd, will metadata allow both forward and backward linking so people can find past and future papers that are associated with a certain data set?
So there are functionality to include that information in DOIs, either past information, so, you know, like a citation, you could include backward-looking things. There is functionality within the Crossref system. I don't know if that functionality is existent in the DataCite system in order to link forward to related data sites, although I do know that the metadata model for each provides that, that capability. Okay. Oftentimes, it's a matter of maintaining the metadata over time.
Okay, right, thanks. And I'll hand back to Heather.
Thank you. I think this question goes to all of our speakers. This person is an editor and asks if any of you have specific advice about how to implement a peer review process for data at a journal.
This is Varsha, so I guess I'm speaking from our experience at Scientific Data. What we've found is that reviewers often aren't used to peer reviewing data, so we have to be prepared to give them extra guidance. So we have a set of specific questions that we ask them to consider when they're looking at the data sets. We're not asking them to open each and every single data file, but just to kind of do a sanity check, really, you know, do the data look reasonable for the kind of experiment that's been carried out? Are all of the data that you would expect to see available from that repository? So yeah, that's from me. Anything to add?
Just that within the text of our Type 4 policy, so as I said, scientific data is even more stringent than our Type 4 policy is, but we have the same type of recommendation. So we have a little checklist for peer reviewers that they can go through, so they're not starting from scratch without any guidance.
Yeah, and having looked at policies that data journals are using, clarity is really important. So what specifically are you looking for? And this will be domain specific. Beyond that, also being realistic about what peer reviewers can do in terms of, you know, sort of what Varsha was saying. It's sort of unrealistic for someone to go and maybe replicate the experiment or replicate the data analysis to proof out the data. But a lot of this information could be, you know, simply viewed in terms of, okay, well, have you marked these things, you know, temperatures in the right ranges, and have you provided metadata so that someone could understand those data? Those are really important. Peer review of actual data doesn't, at least in the study that I've done, is not digging so deep into the data set that you need a kind of PhD in statistics to get it through.
Great. And we have a couple of questions about different policy type levels. So in the case of policy type 3, how do you acknowledge a data set that is shared but not peer reviewed?
Sure. So to be clear, for the type 3 data policies, peer review isn't mandated, but it can still happen. So if you see publications coming through a type 3 journal, there is a possibility that the data are peer reviewed or they may not be. But within the body of that published article or the data availability statement, it won't be stated unless the author has chosen to be explicit about it. So it is, I guess, a gap at the moment in terms of how we would implement more explicit kind of statements around data peer review. But then another one of our services involves the publication of data in repositories in Figshare for authors who would like us to do that for them. And for example, in the metadata records we create there, we do state whether the data have or have not been peer reviewed. So it's also something that could be addressed at the repository level. And that might make more sense, I think, because then anyone accessing the data from anywhere would have access to that information. But at the moment, that's not kind of encoded in our policy text. There's no requirement for it.
Varsha, I think this question is for you as well. In terms of the type 4 policy, have any authors declined to continue with the submission once they recognize that data sharing protocol?
So in order to complete manuscript submission at Scientific Data, you have to have the data available. So if someone does, I mean, just so you know, our editorial office won't let the manuscripts through to even the editor's desk if there's no data there. We, on the other hand, have declined submissions where data have not been, where the authors have not been open to sharing the data in an open fashion. So we have lots of conversations with editorial board members, and they're quite keen for us to hold the line. If people are more interested in our thoughts on this, we have an editorial called Open for Business, which explains why we will not publish data that has any kind of commercial reuse, because we are only wanting to publish data which is open with a capital O.
Thank you. And this question is for all of our speakers. In terms of data citation, do we need to persuade authors to include citations to data in their reference lists? And this may require a habit change, or is it okay to just encourage authors to put their citations in their data availability statement as a separate part of their research article?
My feeling, having been involved in these conversations for a number of years, is that data should be a first-class object in scientific scholarly communications, and therefore should be included in the reference list as a referenced object, not in a data availability statement. That's my own personal opinion, but I think that's an opinion shared by many in the data publishing community.
The idea that data is a first-class scholarly output is from the 411 guidelines or 411 principles on data. And yes, ideally data citations would be listed in the references, so we would have literature citations and data citations listed together equivalently. Again, ideally we would be marking these up in the XML as either being data or literature citations to facilitate citation tracking. And I think data citation tracking is one of the things that will be become a bigger thing in the next few years. It does require author behavior change, because people aren't used to considering data as a scholarly output. They aren't used to citing data that they've used or that they've generated. And this is part of what the research data team at Springer Nature are doing. I mean, this is part of our kind of aims, is to educate both editors and authors in the fact that, you know, data is important, data should be cited, and then how to cite it. And that's a lot of the queries that we deal with at the help desk are to do with how to cite data.
Okay, we have time for a quick last question. I'd like to ask either Rebecca or Varsha, where did you get your 4 data sharing levels from? Did you do a study, or are they based on TOP guidelines?
So this is so the guidelines were put together by Ian Harasny, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He's best placed to actually answer that question. I know that there was a lot of discussion that he did both internally and externally to come up with the 4 levels. This might actually, the fact that we have 4 levels is also possibly going to change, because he's also part of a cross-publisher initiative where publishers from all different publishing houses are coming together to work out what would be a comprehensive and consistent set of data sharing policies for all journals. So that's something that he's doing as part of the Research Data Alliance.
Because I noticed you did say level 1 was specifically for humanities and disciplines that don't need to share data.
Yeah, so it's not disciplines that don't need to share data, it's disciplines that aren't used to sharing data. I mean, that could be journals as well. So it's basically trying to encourage everyone to think about data sharing, but to do it in a very kind of pragmatic way. So, you know, people who are not sure about data sharing, well, just encourage people to at least have thought about maybe providing a data availability statement. So that's that level 1. It's just kind of a soft touch to try and once people get used to the idea that, oh, it's not that scary to provide a data availability statement, even if the statement is to say data available on request, that's okay. At least you're making a statement about the data. So it's more about just helping people to get onto that data sharing train, if you like, rather than enforcing very strict standards from the start, which, you know, people are going to not be very happy with. So
yeah, and you just said before that they can work the way up later.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for your answer, and thank you to all 3 speakers. We're coming up to the hour now, and it's clear there's a lot more to discuss, and also organize and agree on globally, the wider community does stand to benefit from data sharing in general, but as reflected by the presentations, the question and answers, ICMJE and TOP guidelines, and also our COPE core practice statement, there needs to be flexibility, and the important thing is that the data policy or policies being used need to be clear and consistently implemented. Now, the next steps would be for you to please comment on the COPE forum notes at this link on data sharing, so we can develop a formal discussion document in the future, and also comment on the top implementation guidelines mentioned in this link. And very soon after this webinar, you'll receive an email from us, so please do give us your feedback on this webinar. I'd like to thank our guest speakers, Rebecca Grant, Varsha Khodiyar, and Todd Carpenter. Thank you very much. As well as the COPE Education Subcommittee and COPE staff. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for taking part in this webinar, for joining us, taking part in the tool polls, and for asking some great questions. I hope you found the webinar useful. So at this point, I'd like to say thank you very much and goodbye. Some questions we didn't get to, we will put on the summary report. So thank you very much for your time and attention.